Hello, everyone. My name is Oliver Martin, and welcome to Stitfeld Handy Group's Experts Corner. As I said, my name is Oliver Martin. I'm the Director of Training at the Stitfeld Handy Group, and in a little bit, you're going to meet some of my other colleagues as panel members as we have a panel discussion on this month's topic. I'm excited to join you today because for those of you who are not familiar with the Stitfeld Handy Group, our purpose is simple. It's to help people to live and work better together. And for the last 25 years, we've been doing that by providing impactful and engaging learning experiences that transforms the way people interact with each other. Specifically, we provide training on conflict resolution, on negotiation, on dealing with difficult people or how to have difficult conversations, and how to win over irate customers. In addition, we are all mediators here, and we go into workplaces and we mediate disputes between employees, so workplace conflicts. We help transform teams so that they're performing optimally, and we also do one-on-one coaching. Now, since March, since the pandemic, we've transferred all our programs and services to be delivered online. So our trainings are still engaging, and it's done in a virtual instructor-led training format. In other words, it's live online. Experts Corner is simply another platform in which we can help people to live and work better together. Through the Experts Corner webinars, we're able to take our 25 years of expertise around challenging conversations, negotiations, conflict resolution, and relate them to the topics relevant to today. Last month, we focused on the health and safety standards that may arise due to COVID in the workplace, and we had an expert joining us to talk through that. And if you missed that, it's available on our YouTube channel. This month, we're going to leverage the expertise of our instructors to look at how do we have difficult conversations that may arise due to COVID-19. Now, my sense is many of you have had some of these conversations already, and if you haven't, believe me, you likely will. I know my first experience of this was back in March. So in March, when in Ontario, so we're broadcasting from Ontario, because I know we have people from all around the world. In the middle of the month, we kind of went into lockdown, and this is when there was the run on toilet paper and so forth at the supermarkets. And yes, I was one of them. I went to get my toilet paper, but really only because I didn't want to be the last one that was left out. In any event, I remember I go to the supermarket and I get my toilet paper and some other goodies, and I'm standing in line with my cart in front of me and, maintaining the appropriate physical distance, in which and then I remembered that my 6-year-old, there were some candies he wanted, and we're going to be in lockdown probably for several weeks at that point. So I said, let me get it for him. So I step out of line for a moment, leave my cart there, and just take about 20 steps to go and get the gummies, some gummy bears or something that he liked. As I'm walking back to my cart, I notice something. Someone is walking in front of me towards my cart. Then what I see is they take my cart with their bare hands and move my cart out of the line so they can walk around it for a moment. So I froze for a second. I said, no, you don't touch someone else's cart with your bare hands during this time. At least that's what I felt at the time. And by the time I could even formulate something to say, the person had left the supermarket. It was at that point that I realized that, you know what, there are going to be some difficult, important conversations that need to be had during COVID-19 as a result of the pandemic. And based on my conversations with my colleagues, from stories I've heard from people, from the videos that have gone viral about some interactions in workplaces related to COVID-19, we felt that it was important for us to be able to share some skills and tools that you can use to help in those interactions. So as a result, there's this webinar. We also adapted a couple of our courses. So I'm going to speak to you about this later, but our Winning Over Irate Customers workshop, we're going to have some special editions that are focused on COVID-19 and having those type of challenging conversations for frontline workers. Also, there'll be an advanced Dealing with Difficult People workshop for those who have already taken our our Dealing with Difficult People workshop that's going to focus on having those difficult conversations in the workplace. Before I go any further, I do want to go through some logistics with you. So let me quickly review some logistics. I want to make something clear up front is that we'll be sharing a lot of information here in terms of skills and tools to have these conversations. We're by no means providing any legal advice. We recognize that depending on where you're watching this from, there are different bylaws, different legislations and things in place related to COVID-19. We would just offer that it's best for you to check with your local experts on that, in which our goal here is not to provide legal advice, instead the skills and tools to have these conversations. In terms of questions and answers, we do want to hear from you. We're going to have a point when I bring out my colleagues and we'll be taking some questions. So what I'd ask is that there's a Q&A button on your screen right below. You can easily click on that button, type in your question. My colleague, Mark Lawrence, is standing by. He's going to be watching the questions, and at the point where we're going to have our Q&A, he will be relaying the questions to us so that we can answer the questions. I will note that he's reviewing the questions, and when we respond to the question, we might be responding to several questions at once. So essentially, you may not hear your specific question, but do know that we'll cover that question broadly. And if due to time we can't, then we offer that you follow up with us by sending us a quick email, and we will be able to reach back out to you to answer any of those questions that deal with having the conversation, not bylaws or anything like that. So once you type in your question, you can close the box in which you typed in your question and focus on the screen, and then be assured that we're going to address as many questions as possible. Our focus is on those challenging conversations that occur in the workplace related to COVID-19, whether that's between employees, managers and employees. So we're really focusing it in the time we have today on those workplace conversations. For those that may be interested in customer relations type of challenging conversations, do know that we're going to have some resources at the end that you can leverage to apply to those situations. And we also will be providing you some dates for some courses in which we will spend the course talking about those specific situations. So as I said, as workplaces are reopening, there are a lot of new health and safety protocols, and because of that, there will likely be some new and different challenging conversations that people will have to have, whether it's around physical distancing, whether it's around people not perhaps sanitizing some shared spaces or things people are using in the office. It could be about wearing masks. And I know for some, when we say wearing masks, it might be as simple as just tell them to put the mask on. And let's be clear, in certain cases, it may be that simple. In other cases, and from what I've heard, it may not be all so clear cut. Let's take a mask, for example. Someone's wearing the mask, but maybe they're wearing it like this. But they're not covering their nose. So that's an issue. Or maybe you've seen this one where they're wearing the mask kind of like the earring. Or they're a football player now and it's a chin strap. So I don't mean to make light of it, but what I'm saying is that there's different interpretations, different understandings, and that may cause some of the difficulty when we have conversations around things such as wearing masks or physical distancing. So today, we're going to provide you a framework and phrases to help you ease into these challenging conversations regarding COVID-19. I'm going to say it again. Today, we're going to provide you with a framework and phrases to help you ease into those conversations related to COVID-19. But right now, I want to hear from you. We want to hear from all the people that have joined us. And I'm going to ask my colleague Elizabeth to share a poll just so we can hear and get some of your thoughts. So in a moment, Elizabeth is going to put a poll, and we just want to hear from you. What are your top 2 concerns about having challenging COVID-19 related conversations? Take a moment and click at least 2 of them and let us know your thoughts. I see them coming in fast and furious. Okay. Oh, wow. Look at all the responses here. Okay, and when Elizabeth is ready, I'm going to ask her to show the results, but I see a few people. We have about 80% of people responding. Okay. Let's take a look at the results. Yeah, making the situation worse. Look at that. 47% of people is their top concern. One of their top concerns is if we don't get the conversation correct, it can make the situation worse. That can damage relationships. I see that as the next highest one. And of course, not knowing what to say. You see, when I see this, it's clear as to why it's important to have these conversations and to have the skills and tools necessary to have the conversation. Here's what I see. I see a lot of attention, and rightfully so, being spent on, okay, people are coming into the workplace. Do we have the plexiglass up? Are we going to manage how many people come into the office at the same time? And wearing masks, we're going to make sure people wear masks. All these things that are necessary for a safe physical space. But I ask you, are people spending the time equipping their staff, their colleagues, with the skills and tools to have the conversation when compliance is not met? I'm going to make a prediction here. There is going to be a time when someone is not complying for some reason, and it's going to be a challenging conversation. So I ask you, are your colleagues prepared to have these conversations? Has there been attention on equipping them with the skills, tools, phrases to have these conversations? That's what we're hoping to help you with at some point over the next 40 minutes. So let me go to another poll question. So let's get another poll question. And this poll question has to do with how you're feeling about these conversations. So which words best describe how you feel about having challenging COVID-related conversations? Give you a few moments to get in your thoughts. All right, again, they're coming in. All right, give you a few more seconds. We have about 70% of people replying. Okay. There we go. We're sharing the poll results. So anxious, yes, anxious and uncertain. What can we expect? Of course, we're going to be a bit uncertain about it because, again, it's a new norm. It's a new world. We might not be sure. I see there's some people that, or at least one or two people that feel happy about it. So that's great to know that for some people, it's, they might be looking forward to it. But I think the reality is for many of us, it can be uncertain and create some anxiety. I was reading an article from Julia Marcus. She is an epidemiologist and professor from Harvard Medical School. And she just mentions that the pandemic has people beat down, run down from 4 or 5 months of physical distancing, for some people isolation. And now our anxieties might be heightened. We might be a bit quicker to be triggered. For some, now when we tell people to wear a mask, it's a reminder of, oh my gosh, not again. Look at all the work we did up until this point, and still we're not in the clear yet. It's so uncertain for so many of us, and that's creating some anxiety. For some, telling someone to cover their face, it's kind of, that's my identity, and you're telling me to cover it up. Now, to be clear, for some people, that's fine. But it's all these things and uncertainties that cause some of these things that we're feeling in terms of having these challenging conversations. And that's what we're going to want to look at today. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite my colleagues to join me, and they're going to join me so we can have some discussions and provide you with the framework and phrases to ease into the conversations. All right, look at that. I'm not alone now. I have Jason Stead and Eleanor Whitmore to join me. So let me do some brief introductions. Eleanor Whitmore She is the vice president of the Stitfeld Handy Group. A lot of expertise on having challenging conversations. Designed our initial Dealing with Difficult People course, workshop, wealth of knowledge and expertise. So glad to have her join me here on this webinar. And also we have the esteemed Jason Stitt. Jason is one of our instructors. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto. Again, a wealth of knowledge in having these conversations, how to negotiate these conversations, and so much more. So I'd like to welcome them both to joining me here this morning. Morning for me, maybe it's afternoon for some people. So why don't we get started? And Jason, why don't you tell us about what I hinted at when I said ease into the conversation? What have I been alluding to by easing into the conversation? Jason, tell us about that.
Sure. Thank you, Oliver, for the introduction and the ease into this conversation, into a bit about having some difficult conversations during the time of COVID. And we're going to be talking about a model that is based off the letters E, A, S, and E. And you should be able to see on your screens now the initial letters, E, A, S, and E for the ease model. And then if we could go to the next slide, you can see what those letters will indicate, where the first E is going to stand for an emotional check-in, where doing an emotional check-in on yourself. Next letter, the A, is going to stand for analyzing. Next, you'll get to an S, speak, but speak with a question mark. Should we be speaking? And then finally, the last E, explain. And we'll be going a bit more into detail on what those different letters and little lines mean.
Thank you, Jason. So that's the framework that we're going to use to help you ease into these conversations. Now I'm going to ask Eleanor in a moment to break down the E and the A and what that really means. But before that, I just want to remind people that before we ease into these conversations, what's really critical is safety. The first thing we have to think about is safety. Am I maintaining my safety in having these conversations? By that I mean, perhaps you need to address physical distancing with someone in the workplace because you have that colleague that keeps standing right here. Well, safety might mean before addressing how close they are to you, if possible, take a few steps back. Safety might mean if you have to address someone in the workplace around wearing a mask and you think it may be at risk of escalating, perhaps safety is having a couple other colleagues on standby in case you need some extra support. Safety could mean, okay, I need to have this conversation about, again, someone not wearing a mask. Maybe I need to do it over the phone, opposed to being in a certain, too close to them. So we want you to keep that in mind. It starts with safety, and then we can ease into the conversation. So Eleanor, why don't you tell us about the first E, which is emotional check-in?
Yeah, so thanks, Oliver. I was thinking that people might be wondering why our first step of the template is emotional check-in, although anybody who's taken any training with me knows how much I love dealing with emotions, so maybe not surprising. But I think the reason why we started with an emotional check-in is because if a conversation has a lot of unprocessed emotional content, it's going to make the conversation more difficult. And health and safety issues, and COVID is clearly an example of one, health and safety issues tend to bring up a lot of emotional content for people. So if you're heading into a conversation and we heard people say they're feeling anxious or they're feeling scared or they're uncertain or they're angry or they're frustrated, if that emotional content is present but hasn't really been processed, the risk is that that content is going to leak out in the conversation. And then that's going to have the potential to impact the way in which the message is delivered. So if I'm going into a conversation and perhaps I'm very anxious or uncertain or I'm angry, the other person may, first of all, just pick up on the emotional content. If it's not been processed, they'll pick up on the emotional content and they may just simply shut down. Like they may not hear anything, they may get concerned themselves or afraid themselves and they just shut down. Or they may only pick up on the emotional content. So they might be thinking, oh, gosh, she's really angry or she's super frustrated, and they get the emotional content, but they don't get the content of the message that I'm trying to deliver. And certainly they may not get the nuances or subtlety of it. So I want to process the emotional content so that I can deliver the message in a way that increases the likelihood of it being received the way I want it to be received. And also so that I don't regret how I delivered it. So I don't think afterwards, oh, I got too mad or I was too upset, but I don't regret the delivery. So I think that's why we think it's a good place to start.
Okay, so thank you for that, Eleanor, and you've said a lot there. So let me ask you this: what would be your advice in terms of being able to handle and address emotions?
You mean how to do the check-in?
How to do the check-in? Yes.
So I think the advice would be very similar to the advice that we provide generally around managing emotional content, but I'll just, in a nutshell. I think the first thing is just pay attention to the emotional content. So make sure that you check in with yourself. How am I feeling? And maybe do a little bit of a deeper dive on that. So maybe at first you think you're angry about having to have the conversation, but then you really realize it's not that I'm so angry, it's that I'm afraid or I'm uncertain. So first of all, just to pay attention to it. I think the second thing is a lot of people benefit from doing something to manage the physical response to the emotional content. So remembering to breathe and to try to slow down their breathing, or some people might want to go for a walk around the block if they can before they have the conversation, or they might want to stand up and shake it out, like sort of to do something to kind of get physically grounded. And then I think process the emotion, and how you do that's going to depend on your personality and the circumstances. So it may be that you want to talk it through with a colleague and just explain how frustrated you are that you have to have this conversation. Or you may want to do some self-talk and sort of process it internally. You may want to write out some notes, like just something that helps you to kind of manage the emotional content. Mm-hmm. You may decide that in the conversation, you actually want to describe the emotional content. So you might want to say, I'm quite concerned about this situation, or I'm kind of frustrated that we've had to have this conversation a couple of times now. So you may want to describe it. And if you're going to describe it, you need to know what it is. You need to think about how you're going to say it. So, I think that would be another piece. I think the other thing is, particularly these days, I really try to keep in mind that I just think everybody is having a hard time. I think it is really hard for people out there, to varying and lesser degrees and for different reasons, but I think nobody is having a good time. And that means you can anticipate that the other person's going to have a lot of emotional content too, that they may just be upset or concerned or scared or frustrated or anxious quite apart from this conversation. So just being mindful of that, I think, is important as part of the check-in piece.
Yeah, so thank you for that. A lot there, and part of it depends on different strategies. So I like that there's a lot of strategies, because depending on the person, their style, they have some different strategies and tools to be able to do that emotional check-in. And just a very great point that a lot of people are going through this. When I watch the videos, the viral videos on people being triggered in a supermarket or different
Right.
places, and there's just so much emotion going on in there. So I think it's important for all of us to kind of start with that check-in. So then what about the A? Talk to us about the A in ease.
So I think the A stands for analyze. And I think what we're trying to do is just remind people that you really increase the likelihood of the conversation being effective if you do some analyzing in advance, sort of what the situation is, what the context is, what you're trying to achieve. So I was thinking that it might be helpful to just share a couple of questions that might help people to analyze the situation, but I want to be clear. These questions aren't necessarily in some order, because I think they're more interconnected than they are sequenced, but some questions that I think people might want to think about would be, first and foremost, what's the goal of having the conversation? And that may seem like a surprising question, but I think in some cases the goal may simply be, I need that person to change their behavior right now, and this is a one-off. The person who put their hands on your grocery cart. In other cases, it may be that you're really trying to educate the person, or you're trying to persuade them to change their behavior. So, to be sort of clear about what the goal is. And I think some of that might touch on what you think, you can never be sure, but what you think might be behind the behavior. So what I mean by that is, those days when we're back in the office and I'm in the parking lot and I see a colleague of mine getting out of the car and maybe he's not wearing his mask, and I know he's got a commitment to wearing a mask, I might think, oh gosh, he's forgotten, and I might just say, hey, I think you forgot your mask, because we're going to be in those situations where we might forget. So is the person not wearing a mask because they forgot? Is it that they're wearing their mask out of some, for lack of a better word, ignorance, so they don't know any better at this point? Or is it that I know that they've participated in one of the protests against wearing masks, and so I think it's a more determined behavior on their part. So I'm going to want to try to figure out what's behind it. I think I'm also going to want to think about the fact that I may have a number of goals in the conversation. So I noticed that in the poll that you did earlier, that people said one of their concerns was damaging the relationship. So I may have a number of goals. I may want to change their behavior and maintain the relationship. Or I want to change their behavior, but I don't want to negatively impact productivity because now they're so mad at me, they're sabotaging our project. So I may have a number of goals to think about. I think people might want to ask themselves, do I have an obligation to have this conversation? In which case you're going to have to go ahead. So there may be certain people in the workplace who have a certain obligation to ensure health and safety standards are met. So they're going to have to go ahead and have the conversation. In other cases, it may be, I don't have an obligation to, but it's an opportunity. So I could speak with my colleague about this. Do I have the authority to require compliance? Because that might impact how I structure the conversation. What facts might I be missing? So again, I know I've seen people and they're not wearing their masks and I might have a concern about that. I may not realize that they have an underlying medical health condition. So my father has an issue that would prevent him from wearing a mask because his breathing is quite labored. So it may be something like that for people. Stay open to the idea that you may be reacting to something and you don't have all the facts. I think that's the piece about, do I have all the information? Am I the right person to have the conversation? So again, it may be that this is a conversation that your manager should be having with your colleague, and you might want to speak to the manager about it. And then lastly, just giving some thought to the process. So as you said before, are you doing it over the phone? Are you doing it in person? Are you doing it over Zoom? And timing, when to have the conversation. So I think if you, those and other questions can start to analyze the context, your goals, you increase the likelihood of having an effective conversation.
So thank you for that, Eleanor, and very detailed and a lot of things for us to think about. One of the things that comes to mind, and just curious your thoughts on it, Jason, if you have any thoughts as well. What if you want to have this conversation, but you realize that you don't have the authority? They're not reporting into you, let's say. Does that change anything? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think for me, it's one question to ask myself. But again, if it's a colleague who I like and I have a good relationship with, and I think they've forgotten their mask, I may have no authority to make them comply, but I don't need authority because I think they're going to comply. I think they've just forgotten. Right. But if it's somebody who I think is, maybe I have spoken to them and they haven't changed their behavior, or again, I know that they have a stance against wearing a mask, there may be circumstances where it's like, I don't think I'm going to be able to influence them. I don't think I'm going to be able to persuade them. And authority may be required. And if I don't have the authority, then I may need to go to the person who does have the authority.
Thank you for that. And just to note a couple things when I just look at the Q&A. If you have some questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. And some people are asking, will you get a copy of the slides? Yes, we'll be sending out a copy of the slides with the extra resources. And just to kind of touch back on that again, Eleanor, there's a part of it where I'm kind of hearing that, at least at first pass, it might be giving people a benefit of the doubt. Like, is there some information that I'm missing? Do we have different understandings of what's going on? I'm reminded of getting my hair cut. So I went to get my hair cut, and barber was great, had the gown on, and said, oh, the gown might be warm, Oliver, because it just came out of the dryer. Oh, wow, awesome. He's wearing his mask and everything. And although he's wearing his mask, because there were some other people around, he didn't want to hear them He didn't want them to hear what he was saying to me. So now all of a sudden I see him and his face is like right here whispering something to me. So there's a part where, okay, yes, you have a mask, but there's also a distance piece as well. So again, people may just have different interpretations. This person obviously was familiar with all the standards, but had a different thought or just forgot in the moment. Just because you have a mask, you don't have to kind of whisper in my ear like that. So thank you. So what about, so Jason, let's move on to the S. So tell us about the S in ease.
Sure. So the S is for speak, and speak with a question mark. Is this an appropriate time to speak? Is this a conversation that's better to have now or better to have later? And going back to the comment of the poll question about what some of the biggest concerns were from the group, I noted that the two were making the situation worse and damaging the relationship. And those are real things that you need to take into account when you're deciding, is now an appropriate time to speak? I think we've all experienced times in our lives where you're in a situation and there's something that you may want to say, there's a conversation that you may want to have at the time, you want to get the point out to the other person, but you realize on some level that if I'm talking now, that has the potential to make the situation worse. If I had this conversation tomorrow, or maybe it's not even a conversation that needs to be had at all, that's potentially going to be a better way to think about it. That's going to apply in this context too. Also, with respect to damaging the relationship, you want to think about, would speaking now potentially damage the relationship? And then the flip side, would not speaking now potentially damage the relationship? Because the whole COVID situation is leaving open a lot of things where maybe you're in Eleanor's situation and there's a colleague who's not wearing their mask and you don't know why they're not wearing their mask. And you think, I'm not going to speak to them. I don't want to have this conversation. They're probably a person who protests wearing masks. So I'm just going to take myself away from dealing with them. And potentially it's just, it slipped my mind. I totally forgot. I'm so used to always coming into the office and not wearing a mask. And just having that conversation can help build back that and maintain that relationship, and avoiding the conversation could damage the relationship. So it can work on both ends there, where you're saying, should I speak? What's going to be better for the relationship? Am I going to be making the situation worse?
Thank you. I like that, because I think we don't always think about the impacts. I think we think about the impacts of speaking. We don't always think about the impacts of not speaking. So thank you for making that very clear. And it speaks to why we have that question mark, because there's something to think about there in terms of speaking or not speaking. What about the final E, Jason?
So the final E is getting into explain. So this is where you're talking to the other person, and this is assuming that you've made the decision in the speak one before of, yes, I'm going to speak. So if you are going to speak, you're going to explain some things to the other person. You want to explain how the behavior is impacting you. You may want to ask them to stop doing the behavior. You may want to offer a reminder to them. You may want to ask them some questions about what's happening. Inquire about why they're not complying, why they're doing what they're doing, and where that's coming from. One thing that's really important with explain is to be mindful of how you're communicating. Over the last number of months, a lot has changed with how we communicate. There's a lot that's different about how I'm communicating right now compared to how I would be communicating with everybody if we were all in person together. That's different. Another thing that's different is when you're wearing a mask. If I'm wearing a mask and my mouth and my face is covered, you couldn't tell if I was smiling there or not. You couldn't really tell what I was trying to portray to you. It's a lot harder to tell tone even through mask if you're wearing a mask at the time, and it's harder to tell some body language things. So when you're talking, it's important to be clear, and you may need to be more expressive about your tone than you normally would be, and you also may need to mention some things. You may need to actually say, "Hey, so nice to see you." Something like that, where you're conveying some happiness if you want to get happiness across. If you're wanting to convey seriousness, you may need to say something to convey that. But there's additional work that needs to be done, and we need to be really mindful about our tone because people are going to have a harder time picking up on those nonverbal cues that are normally quite easy to pick up on if you're in person interacting with the other person.
Great, thank you for that, Jason. Lots to think about with explain. So let me just recap. When we talk about easing into some of these challenging COVID conversations, related conversations, what we're saying is always be mindful of your safety. Then let's do the emotional check-in. Let's analyze, what's going on. Maybe it's giving them the benefit of the doubt if it's the first time, but there are some questions to guide us in analyzing it. Then let's determine if we are going to say something or not. Remember, even our not saying anything does send a message. And then, as Jason just said, let's explain. That is a framework that could be helpful in easing into some of these challenging conversations. Now, the framework is not to determine what the outcome is going to be, in that you then, I'd say, have to listen. So once you've done the explanation, let's pause and let's listen. And then let's engage in further dialogue if necessary. Now, here's the thing I think some people are thinking, and I saw it as a question that popped up is, okay, yeah, we need to explain, Jason, we need to explain this stuff, but like, what do I say? What do I say? What are your thoughts, Jason? What are some language, phrasing, wording that could be helpful for us?
For sure. So part of it is dependent on the different situation. So in your different contexts that you're in, you're going to be using some different language. So in terms of a couple of different ideas, one possibility is using what we call standards of legitimacy. So what you could say is, our company policy is to wear a mask. Is there any reason you're not wearing one? And that's just sort of putting the question to them, and then also referring back to something concrete. You didn't come up with the company policy, so you're just referring to something outside of your relationship, outside of this conversation, to try to be persuasive towards getting them to wear a mask. Another possible approach that you might take in terms of explaining is taking some of the blame on yourself. So you may say something like, I have a family member who's very vulnerable, so I have to be extra cautious. Or you may say something like, maybe I'm overreacting. If you stand back a few steps, it would help me to feel more comfortable. By not putting it on the other person and sort of blaming and attacking them, they may be more likely to hear you out and listen to what you're saying.
So let me jump in there, because one of the questions that came up was, Oliver, like, what did you do in that situation? What did you say when that situation, being the barber, kind of right in my ear? Well, when that happened, I more went with the nonverbal, in terms of he saw a little flinch, but I couldn't flinch too much because, as you can imagine, there's this sharp object in my hair and I don't want to mess up the fade. But then I took some time to think about it and say, you know what, if he does come back to do that again, in my mind, it was going to be essentially what you were saying there, Jason. Maybe I'm overreacting. If you can just refrain from whispering, it's just going to help me feel a bit more comfortable to kind of get my hair cut. So that's
I'm not sure if you could tell. The approach that I took was not to get a haircut in the first place and avoid the difficult situation altogether.
Right. That's safety first, right? Just avoid
safety first.
Safety first.
Got you. Eleanor, did you want to add one or two more phrases?
I did, actually, because I was remembering, gosh, we're all in the learning phase about how to do this. And one of the very first times I went for a walk with a friend of mine, and we were going to maintain physical distance. And so we were out at a big park, and we started out 6 feet apart, and then he was sort of getting closer, because it's just natural, right? It's still new for us. So he was sort of coming towards me, and I was feeling a bit awkward, and I didn't want to criticize him and things. And then I did say, I think we're supposed to keep the distance a little further. And I could see that it landed a little badly. And he said, like, do you think I haven't been careful or something? And what I tried there, and I've been working on it ever since, is to try to be clear to people that for me, it's as much about protecting them as it is protecting me. So absolutely, I'm hoping not to get it. But now that we know that people may be asymptomatic, I also want not to give it to somebody. So what came up for me was just sort of saying, like, I would feel terrible if I ended up giving it to you. So it's both ways. So that was one thing for me. And then I'm also just a big fan, to the degree that I can, of trying to help other people to save face. And again, I think for many of us, we're going to forget, we're going to make mistakes because this is new to us, particularly when we go back to the office. It's been a while since we've been doing some of the things. We haven't been behaving this way in the office. So just to say, you know, gosh, things have changed so much since we were last in the office. You know, it's easy to forget your mask. I think you may have forgotten your mask, or just, you know, something like that. Things have kept changing. It's a lot to keep up with. I think we're supposed to stick 6 feet apart, like just to give them a chance to save face.
Right. So thank you for that, Eleanor. And just so you know, we have a few more of these phrases that we're going to share with you in our follow-up resources that you'll likely get tomorrow at some point. So do check that out, because you're going to see, again, some other wording, various options, so you have some to choose from that may apply to your specific situation. I find it's helpful to just have them in your back pocket. These conversations will happen. You just don't know when. So by having some kind of stock phrases, wording, that can be helpful. In a moment, I'm going to go to the Q&A, but what I'm hoping at this point is that you're starting to see how having a framework and phrases can help you ease into these conversations. So I just want to share with you a couple other things that we're doing to help in this initiative, or to help to share the knowledge. We have a couple workshops coming up. One of them is called Winning Over Irate Customers, and that's focused on for frontline staff that have to have some of these challenging COVID-related conversations with customers. So whether it's people, let's say, working in retail or just front-facing, maybe it's in an administrative role. You know, I think back to other workshops where it could be someone in a municipality that deals with external clients over the phone. As we know, the anxiety there leads to some simple requests escalating. So this is meant for that group. It's called Winning Over Irate Customers with a COVID-19 focus. We're going to have a one-day session from 9 to 4 on August 24th. Or for some that prefer the half day or can only allow their staff to go for half day, it'll be on September 15th and 16th for a half day. The other course that we're offering is what I'd call an advanced dealing with difficult people course, in which it's a one-day course for those who already took our dealing with difficult people workshop, and that is focused now on dealing with difficult conversations related to COVID in the workplace. So for managers, HR staff, and so forth, it's going to be a focus, an enhancer from the 3-day workshop that you would have taken before. You're going to get details on this in the follow-up email, but I just wanted to announce it to you on the webinar today because you're going to have first access to register. We're not going to be releasing this to the public until Friday afternoon. So now's your window in case you're interested. The investment is $425, which I think is a good investment for one day or for 2 half days. Okay, let's look at the Q&A. And we have a couple minutes, so for those that have to head out at 11:45, that's fine. Feel free to say bye, and you're going to get some follow-up resources. We will take a couple questions for those that have sent some questions in. I know we've answered some as we've moved along. One of the questions for the panelists are, how does one keep their emotions in check and not get angry in the moment? Since, Eleanor, you spoke about emotions, I'm going to put that question to you.
Yeah, so I guess I would say it's really hard to do. And I think the best thing you can do is try to anticipate if you're going to get angry, as I said, figure out what's going to work for you to try to manage that emotional content. It may be sometimes that you need to articulate it, to just say to the person, I'm finding myself getting a bit angry here. And sometimes even just saying it aloud will help to kind of release it a little bit. And there may be other times where you just say, I think we're going to have to continue this conversation later. So you may not be able to continue the conversation. So I think it's okay to have the emotional content. It's whether you can process it to the degree that you are still able to have the conversation effectively. And sometimes the emotional content is important feedback for people. So the fact that you're angry is important for them to know and understand. You just don't want to deliver it in an extremely angry way. That's where we get into trouble. So those would be some top of mind thoughts.
All right, thank you for that, Eleanor. A couple more questions. In the framework, can this be used to also identify whether you should speak or communicate in other ways, such as writing? Jason, why don't I put that to you?
Yeah, so given that the speak part of ease is a question mark, I think that it's a good question. And it doesn't necessarily, the answer can be, yes, I want to speak out loud. The answer could be, maybe this is something that's better, the conversation is better to have over video, where you're speaking not in person to the person because maybe there's a safety concern. Maybe there are reasons why it would be better. Maybe it's better to answer in writing. Maybe it's better to say something to them in writing. Maybe it's better to, and again, going back to the earlier comment about authority, maybe it's better to bring it up to somebody else. Those are all considerations that you want to think about in terms of, should I be speaking, or what approach should I be taking? And what's important to keep in mind is, whatever approach you're taking, that's an approach. That's a decision that you're making to do something. So deciding not to do anything is still a decision. Deciding to do something by writing is still a decision.
All right, thank you for that, Jason. I realize we're at 11:45. I will take a couple more questions. And again, if we don't get to your question, feel free to just take the same question and send it to us, email it to us, because I see a few that are a bit more specific, and I think it'd be worth a conversation. So definitely open to having that conversation. So here's a question. It looks like it's back to you, Eleanor, for emotions. Is the emotional check-in only for us, or are we also checking in on the individuals?
Yeah, so this is a great time to maybe just put forward a quick reminder that the ease template is about what we're doing to kind of prepare for the conversation and get the conversation started. It doesn't go so far as into the conversation itself. So in theory, the check-in is for ourselves because this is how we're preparing for the conversation. But I think the question is an excellent reminder that we may want to check in with the person in the actual conversation. So I did say, as part of the prep, at least be mindful that chances are they have a lot of emotional content. Whether you want to check in with them or not about it will depend on the circumstances, but absolutely, I think it's a good thing to think about whether you might want to say, how are you doing these days? Or, what feelings are coming up for you around wearing a mask, or whatever it is, but to explicitly check in with them. Absolutely.
All right, thank you, Eleanor. So let's end on this question. I think it's a question that perhaps several people might be thinking, and it's how do I have these conversations when people are aggressive, passionate, or borderline violent? So again, let me put that out to the panel. Who wants to take first stab at that one?
I'll take a crack at it, and then I'm going to hope that Jason will have a chance to answer with a bit of reflection. I feel very differently when the word passionate is used than when we transition to borderline violent. So I think when we talk about borderline violent, you'd mentioned safety before, Oliver, and I think you were speaking perhaps more specifically, like, do I feel safe with respect to COVID? Do I need to keep my 6 feet of distance from this person? But this is, again, a reminder, this is safety in all categories. So if I think that somebody's going to be potentially violent, that's going to have an enormous impact on whether I have the conversation, how I have the conversation. So do I do it over Zoom as opposed to in person? If I have to do it in person, do I want somebody else there? So if there's any risk of violence, I think that's a whole different thing than if I just think this person feels very strongly about it, but can manage not to be violent. In which case, in some cases, I think the advice is just to acknowledge that, to just say, my sense is that you feel very strongly about this. So to convey to them that you have registered how passionate they are about it. And then to say, can you tell me more about why you feel strongly? Or I'd like to understand that better. Again, we come from the perspective of the best way to persuade somebody is to understand where they're coming from, to understand what their perspective is. So I might, if I just thought they feel strongly about this, they have a very strong view, to acknowledge it and inquire about it. But if it's violence, I think that's a different matter.
Thanks, Elma. Did you want to jump in, Jason, or is that good?
Yeah, just to sort of add on, because I agree with what Eleanor was saying, but the mentality of sort of de-escalating some of those situations where, and again, if it's a violent situation, you want to be thinking safety first. You don't want to be having this conversation when they're throwing punches. That's not the situation that we want anybody to be in. But I think going back to what Oliver talked about some of those viral videos that we all see, it does seem to me sometimes like the focus of the person with the camera is to get a viral video. And they're more focused on how can I get a good, funny, viral video that's going to get me a lot of likes on Twitter, rather than, okay, this person's clearly really upset. This person's clearly really bothered. Is there something that we can do to put forward to demonstrate to them that we're willing to hear them out, where maybe they're so passionate because they feel like nobody's listening? And being open to listening, hearing them out can, I would say, potentially be helpful. Again, not in those necessarily violent situations, but maybe in the more passionate situations.
And what you're hearing from both of my colleagues is there's a part about this that's about de-escalation. And unfortunately, we don't have the time to talk about that, but we do talk about those in our workshops, how to de-escalate people so that now they're engaged in having some of these conversations. I recognize it seems challenging at the outset, but that's kind of the first step to be able to start to engage with people. I see one question that's just a quick answer, and that's to take the advanced training, do I have to take the Dealing with Difficult People workshop first? Short answer is yes, because this one day, and it's a bit less than one day, from about 9 to 3 p.m. is going to pick up. We're assuming that you have the knowledge and content from before, and we're taking it from there. So that's the short answer. Let me take a moment to thank my colleagues here, both Jason and Eleanor. I know Mark has been behind the scenes responding to some of you with your questions. For those who still didn't get their question answered, again, a reminder, do reach out to us. We'd love to be able to connect with you. If you haven't figured it out, we like talking about this stuff, and we really do want to help people to interact better together. We want to end by doing a last poll. And this poll is just to give us some information that can help us with future webinars. So it's going to ask you for some possible webinar ideas based on some ideas that we thought of and some other things. If you can take your last 90 seconds to fill out that poll, we'd be eternally grateful. Thank you so much for joining us on Experts Corner, and we're looking forward to seeing you at a future Expert Corner or at one of our workshops. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Good luck.
Thank you, everyone.